Welcome back to mine and Cole's YouTube series. I am a master's student in clinical mental health counseling with a bachelor's degree in psychology. This is Cole. He is my co-author, my future research partner, and my friend, most importantly. So now we're going to be talking. He did a little salute. Now we're going to be talking about our inspirations for Don't Say Cis in a lot more detail. So we have a recommended reading section. Of course, we talk about our inspirations there. We're going to get in way more depth about it. And our last video with the book list, we did talk about some stuff, but we didn't get to go in much depth because it was a 40-minute video. So we'll talk about around like 5 or 6 people and works, and we'll get really in depth. So first, Cole, let's talk about our role in implementing these inspirations. Okay.
So, yeah, our role when it came to taking inspiration, essentially it felt like you would come out with big like conceptual ideas or like foundational ideas of philosophy or psychology, and you would explain those to me. And at least from my perspective, how I would think about it is I would then instantly start like filing through my bookshelf in my head and thinking about all the books I could connect these same principles to and how they use those principles, from my understanding. And there was lots of discussion about how those principles were used in different books, how we could use them in different ways, how we could flip tropes on their head, how we could just change the scene. Yeah, and it's inspiration is such an important part and influence. There's a guy, a literary critic, Harold Bloom, and that's essentially that's one of his major things he talks about is influence and how other works influence other works all the way down the line through the history of literature. So yeah, it's just such a fascinating thing, a very crucial thing as well. There's kind of that thing like, oh, there's not any original ideas today, but there are. It's just a lot are drawn from the previous influences as well. I mean, once you come down to it and you break it down, you're going to end up the influence with the most basic story archetype, and all stories are influenced by, that's just how the history of literature and books roll. So inspiration is a huge part in any book that you're going to, and influence. You have to use it. It has to be crucial. It has to be part of it. And you have to have great understanding of your influences because you never want to go in and do them a disservice.
I think I would find something I liked a lot, want to discuss a lot, So a lot of like nihilism, for instance. I think, we'd also collaborate on that process though, and we would collaborate and find what was important to us, what stuck out to us, and then, typically you in general, but I'd also help with this, but we'd weave it in the narrative, and we'd find a way to weave it and have different layers of the narrative where, like our basic inspirations and our basic ideas were the surface level, right? What most people will probably retain from the novel. The people who look a little deeper will find the second layer, and then the people who look the deepest and who understand these complex works that we've read, like Nietzsche, for instance, is the biggest one I would say for nihilism. They come away with something a little bit more, but everyone can come away with some layer of understanding, and I think we weave that into the entire narrative so that it told a cohesive philosophical message, and then also having a fun story. So let's get into the discussions, in-depth discussions about our particular inspirations. So, cool. I'll let you take the first rank on this one. So let's start with Dante's Inferno. So I know you love Inferno. So
yeah, obviously, Inferno. It's one of those works. When I was bringing up, it seems like that one that spread its influence everywhere by now. Such an early work, such a seminal work. I'm sure most people, I think it's required reading for school. I definitely felt like I read a lot of passage, but there's a reason for it. Great work. It was very interesting to find ways to incorporate the Dante's Inferno inspiration into our story. Obviously, the biggest scene that stands out to mind is the apartment scene in Dante's Walk. Obviously, besides our character literally being named Dante as well. Yeah, so Dante's name, obviously, probably the biggest right there in your face influence you can see. But specifically, a scene that I think about crafting is Dante's walk through the apartments, and as he goes through the different levels, and you can see the different levels of Dante's Inferno being enacted there. In a very interesting way is we're showing how this world is kind of creating this hell that Dante is walking through, and how these different levels, how this world is incorporated into that, how it's feeding into that, letting these people live like that. Yeah, there was it was a lot. It was always a lot of fun to go back to Dante's Inferno and just kind of try to conceptualize how we can make it stand out and seem just like that.
Yeah, and building off your idea about Dante's name in particular, I remember I presented the idea because I was saying the main character, he is going to have a trek through hell, right? Like it's going to be very reminiscent of that journey. And, I mean, it seems, we kind of chose a very obvious name, right? But I think it was a fun thing to do. It was very fun for us to use Dante's name in particular. So I have no regrets about using that name. But, it's a very obvious tie into Dante's Inferno. So the original idea was presented because it was Dante's trek through hell. And the apartment scene Cole's referring to, in chapter 4, we get to go to the top floor of the apartment scene, right? So that is floor 4, and then you got to pay attention to the room numbers, right? Because the room numbers tie into what circle of hell. And, in floor 4, he meets this character named Jay, and they're very lustful. Jay and her group are very lustful. In chapter 5, as he leaves his apartment complex, there's this very Kafkaesque, surreal element to it, but it's essentially Dante's Inferno, right? So they go through Dante goes through each floor. And each floor is each circle going down and down. And that's when we get to, you go from lust to gluttony to greed. And that greed is something that we think is more prevalent than some of those other sins of incontinence. And so that floor in particular has a little bit more of a tie-in to the story. And then we go down to floor 1 with anger and wrath. And, so we try to mirror some of those elements of punishment even in each floor. And the concept behind that trek for Dante is the sins of incontinence are so prevalent because those are the individuals who lack moderation, and this entire world, because they have no purpose, they lack moderation because there's a particular tie-in between nihilism and hedonism. And the reason we wanted to show that particular 4 sins is because those are the hedonistic sins, the sins of incontinence. So that's a conceptual reason why Dante's Inferno was so crucial for us to go in depth with.
Absolutely.
So Cole, let's get to our next impression that I think was key that I outlined here. Okay, the trial.
Yeah, absolutely. When you first came to me, this was like, I feel like the first book that you presented to me, and you were like, this is something like, I want to use this. Like, it was almost a prompt for this story. It felt like you wanted someone to go to trial. You wanted someone to wake up in a different time, kind of randomly, not know what to do in this different world. So yeah, those same concepts, very easily seen. 2 big trial scenes throughout our story. I know the trial is pretty much just the trial scene, but we wanted to add a little more flavor to our story. We wanted to flesh it out a little bit more. And as well as that, obviously, there's a lot of Kafka-isms, I feel like, in our book is very Kafkaesque, I would say. There's a lot of surrealism, a lot of Kafka concepts, ideologies. But conceptually, yeah, there's a lot of influence directly from the trial.
Yeah, I agree. And just so the viewers at home can understand what you were discussing when you say that, can you talk more about like the Kafka-esque writing, the style that you were saying? So you said it's like intertwined between our narrative.
This very surreal world being built here. This very like everyone's acting like it's all normal, but it's all very, very, very wrong. And you get that feeling, I feel like, throughout the whole book, especially through Dante's perspective. Like when you think of the trial, there's no better way to showcase surrealism than taking a person in an ordinary time and then just randomly dropping them in some obscure time. And everyone acting like it's all normal while he's perceiving it as the most strange, most absurd thing that he could see. So yeah, that type of, loss and feeling of unsettlingness because the whole world around you is just doesn't feel real. It just feels like a different world. That's the concept foundation of surrealism that Kafka was so prevalent at, and that's what we tried to replicate a little bit as well in our writing.
Right. Right. And I would even describe the narrative as like a fever dream.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then another reason that this was a big inspiration for me in particular, I mentioned this in the last video, but I'll say a little more here, is it does better at showing oppressive natures of dystopians in general than I think other dystopians do. And what I mean by that is, since we only focus on one character in the trial, we focus on one character and his particular story. It's very through his point of view. Um, it doesn't focus on the wider context of society, and because of that, you feel more ground level. You feel more grounded with the character as well. And when they face this oppressive battle, you're at such a low, insignificant level that the powers just above you seem all powerful. And I think that's what the bureaucracy does in the trial, and it feels super strong throughout the entire book. Its presence, it's the essence of it, weighs on him even when he is just talking to somebody else about something else. And that's the kind of feeling that we wanted to replicate a little bit with society feeling too overwhelming for our main character, where it's so oppressive and he's on the ground level, just becoming accustomed to it, just like in the trial where he's brand new to these ideas and these concepts. He doesn't really understand, like, why is he even arrested, right? For instance, and for our character, of course, he's in a new time, doesn't understand why, and he doesn't understand any of the systems. He doesn't understand any of the structures, and so that's pretty much what I wanted to say about the oppressive nature of the government and the bureaucracy in the trial versus our society and the societal influence, because it's less so the government being too overwhelming and oppressive, and that's where ours dystopian is a little more unique. Is it's societally oppressive versus governmentally oppressive. That's a slight differentiation between most dystopians.
And I think that was a very fine line to walk, showing that it's through society, not through politics. Obviously, how we wanted our society's ideology to be like influenced and wider thinking the way it was, we chose the government to showcase that in mass media because that's the most realistic way it goes about it. But it's very hard to try and not make it about politics because that's not what we wanted to do at all. That's not what we were trying to do. But obviously, we're using political positions in our story, and we're talking about positions of power and authority. So
Yeah.
it was a very hard line to walk to make sure that it was just society that was kind of perpetuating these ideas and not too much of the focal point being a government assessment or a political rant.
Yeah, Cole, can I say something about that too?
Absolutely.
I think we used the government as the effect of society. So what I'm saying is the government showed the zeitgeist of society, right? Like it was the politics of the time, but it wasn't the government's fault. It was all society determining something new, right? So, like, for instance, the law on free speech, that the government didn't just choose that, of course. Like, society was pushing heavily forward. We can see that in our society, of course. They all agree with it, right? Um, and it's things like that where the government is really a reflection of how society has changed their political or philosophical views, I would even say. So, um, I think that's where that differentiation is, where you're mentioning. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. The way it's just society is the cause and the government effect, that's really a great way to put it, really.
yeah, and one more thing that was pretty interesting about the trial, right? Of course, it's absurd. Our book's absurd, right? That goes without saying. But the absurdism leaks into the court systems, and in the trial, of course, the courts have changed a lot, right? Like we see him go to these places where he's talking to a judge, and it seems just so insignificant, and just people around just doing random things and disturbing the peace, and the judge is more temperamental, right? Like we see things that are just not normal for for trials in the U.S. Well, of course, we took inspiration from that, right? In our novel, the trials, and this is again a reflection of society more so than governmental overstepping their bounds, their boundaries. But what we see is the court of public opinion. That was the biggest thing. I remember when we first started talking about this book, that's something I said we need to implement is the court of public opinions. The reason for that was because stuff we've seen in modern times where people really want to have their voice heard in terms of court decisions. They don't want just the jury to do it. They don't want the judge to determine sentencing. They want complete control over it. This can be a little bit attributed to nihilism. It can be attributed to tribalism. It could be attributed to a few things, right? But regardless of why that reason is, that's a very big difference between what we have now and what that is. Like the world we've crafted doesn't have due process. They have very quick trials because they just don't really need to review any evidence. They're ready to just go in and talk about really instead of the facts of the case, the feelings attributed to it, right? And a lot of this is from the trial, a lot of this inspiration from the trial. And you see in our book, people take a vote on court cases, so I mean, just the differences in court and how scary that can get very quickly is something that I drew inspiration from Franz Kafka, where take something that we see a little bit today and could potentially be drastically different in the future and has a lot of predictive value and it's played out in the book, right? And I think that's what Kafka did, and I think that's what we did pretty well. I think our story will inevitably have good predictive value because of a lot of things that we're seeing in society today. So next inspiration, Cole, Fredrich Nietzsche, right? He's a fantastic philosopher, and he was a big inspiration for us in a lot of ways. So if you want to touch on that.
So Nietzsche, obviously a lot of influence. Great existentialist thinker, a great nihilistic thinker. I think either way, how you read the text, it's foundational to the thinking process of both those philosophies. You can see it both ways. I believe Hunter just told me Nietzsche considered himself an existentialist, correct? I would have to say that his viewpoints probably fall more in line with that, but I totally get why people would see him more nihilistic. So when me and Hunter, I guess I don't want to put words in his mouth, but when I see existentialism, it's almost like more, I don't want to say a solution to nihilism, but it's kind of like a more brighter outlook than nihilism. Nihilism can seem so bleak and so devoid at times. And I think that's a lot of the nihilism we talk about in our book is this kind of devoid nihilism. And existentialism, it feels like a way to find purpose when you're stuck in nihilistic thought. Like it's almost, at least for me, in like my journey with like philosophical thinking, right? Like you get past the religious basic foundational philosophy you learn growing up in the church, and then that might devolve into nihilism, and then for me at least, I feel like my nihilism then evolved into existentialism.
Cole really focused on the wider context of Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas and his overall life philosophy. So because of that, I'm going to focus more on the ground level. I'm going to focus on how Nietzsche's ideas focused on really focused on how nihilism will change the structure of society. Okay, so with that, of course, he proposed God's dead, right? And that can be taken in a lot of ways, but the way that we take it and the way I think it's pretty widely taken is he is concerned that without religion, even though it's more prevalent than atheism, right? Without religion, people will tend towards nihilism, and that will have a ripple effect on society. And it's important to note that not all atheists are nihilists, but only atheists can tend towards nihilism, right? And then you get the effects of it, where nihilist tends towards totalitarianism. Nihilist tends towards more control, and that's because they don't have something on top of their, let's say, something that they can transfer their energy of worship to, as Carl Jung would put it, right? So you have a certain amount of energy you would put towards worshiping God. You need something to direct that energy to, right? That's why we have a relationship with ghosts and figures in the dark, right? Because we lose our relationship with that. We lose our energy focused towards what the light would have in there, that we start attributing our energy gets transferred inward. We start attributing it to something different, right? We use that same idea, right? So the people in our world, they worship government, and they tend towards totalitarianism. They worship celebrities. The nihilists have no purpose, and they just drift through life, and they almost don't want to even do that. That's almost too much of an ask to drift through life. That's a lot of Nietzsche's ideas, and of course, you mentioned the void, right? So the void was another big thing for us, where we use a lot of symbolism, which I won't get into. We'll get that to another video. But a lot of symbolism attributed to Fredrich Nietzsche with the void and the abyss, right? The abyss is very important because that is the culmination of the inner nihilistic tendencies in philosophical beliefs. That's how I would put it. That's how I see it. And so a lot of people, they stare into the abyss, and they walk into it, and they live within it, even though perhaps there is some light on the outside, but no one around them can help them realize that potential and that light. So everyone stays in this abyss of no purpose. I think a lot of those ideas and concepts we use in our book. Similar to Nietzsche, though, similar but almost the opposite of the end of the spectrum, but something similar for our conversation, Viktor Frankl. So I'll discuss Frankl first, if you don't mind, Cole. So
please go ahead. Yes.
Awesome. So of course, Viktor Frankl talks about purpose and finding purpose in a meaningless world, right? And he uses Fredrich Nietzsche's ideas like those who have a why will bear almost any how, right? Which is also, you mentioned earlier, why some people think Nietzsche is an existentialist. But, culminating your own purpose and having life ask you what purpose is. You can see this in a lot of our characters. I mean, you can see it with our characters like Dante and Leo and Lucy when they get transferred into this world. You can see it with Alan Redmond. You can see it with the schooling, the director for plays in the school. There's a lot of characters, the clerk, a lot of characters who exemplify this philosophy. So you will see it in our book of people who try to culminate their own purpose in the meaningless. The world is meaningless. Let's say scientifically, philosophically, and societally, the world is meaningless. Let's say there's people who defy that, and there always will be. And so we don't want to be extremely bleak and just dark. So that's something to keep in mind from Viktor Frankl. What he says is purpose can be found in love and through love. Okay. So a big thing for us was, even though in psychological research, maybe you won't say love in particular is something that you find purpose in, but it's certainly, it fits into one of the three broad categories. Okay. So love is certainly one that is psychologically sound, a purposeful way to find purpose and meaning in life. And so we use Viktor Frankl's idea of love. That's the biggest catalyst for purpose in our world. So, like you see our character Dante, he goes to the world, and he's more of a, let's say, blank slate, because he is a vessel for the world to talk to, right? So the world talks through him to the reader. But regardless, he still has that basic human emotion of the need for love. It hasn't been denigrated by lust. Let's say for other characters, like in chapter 4, there's no denigration of love for Dante. So he loves his niece to the fullest extent. He loves his brother to the fullest extent. And that's what gets him through the end. Because without those characters, even when there's some turbulation with those characters, that really shakes him. And we show that symbolically with Fredrich Nietzsche's Abyss, right? We show that symbolically. That really shakes him. But because of that representational thought of the love he has, and that how, it's pretty similar to the Holocaust in Man's Search for Meaning, where Viktor Frankl gets through the Holocaust through love and in love. That's the main thing I want to talk about with him. And just tie it all together real quick before I let Cole talk about Frankl, is Nietzsche and Viktor Frankl discussed thoroughly why suffering is important. So Viktor Frankl believes that suffering is important because you're only allowed to rise above your fate and your determined fate if you go through suffering. Anyone who go through suffering can rise above their fate. So it's important for people to go through suffering. But the philosophy of this world isn't like that. The philosophy of the world is suffering is bad. You should have an easy, comfortable life. And Fredrich Nietzsche says similar things about suffering, where you're permitted to prove yourself and you should be thankful for suffering. And this world is uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. And so that's a big thing why people have become very soft and very not able to rise above that fate of society, which is already very rare for any society. But when you have a society that coddles to comfortability, you can't have anyone rise above their determined fate unless they're very, very, very few and far between. So, Cole, your word on Viktor Frankl and how it inspired Don't Say Cis.
Yeah, I mean, that was a sensational job done by you, Hunter. Um, just a lot of piggybacking off of that, really. Frankl, a lot of his ideas was very foundational. In our top 10 books, Hunter brought up Man's Search for Meaning, which was just very, very, very important to the ideas presented in our book. And one of my favorite points that you brought up at the end there was Frankel's idea that you have to suffer to like elevate your fate. Yeah, and that's just a lot of, and I can almost see that reflected in our work where not that Dante necessarily was looking to have his fate be elevated, but through his suffering and through just his perseverance, because what his meaning was for him, his fate seemed to be elevated. He seemed to be made out to a martyr type, this type, that ends up sacrificing at the end. I know, obviously, our story, how it ends, is more of a tragedy. It's not meant to be a happy note or necessarily, but to me, I feel like that could definitely be taken as an interpretation of Dante's, story.
So our next inspiration I want to talk about is Dostoevsky. So for inspiration wise, I mean, I think you agree is he's just fantastic at making realistic and reliable uh, characters in a world that they're in, right? So um, we have a few characters like that. We have Dr. Erickson. So he is, named after some psychologist I'm interested in, but he's really based off of Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. We take the idea that you can be too rationalistic, you can be too focused on the rational, the logic, and the science that you can drive yourself towards nihilism. You can drive yourself towards rationalizing in your brain what is wrong because you're so smart that you overthink the right? And so you almost go against moral intuitions, you go against the pull towards humanity, and then you can talk yourself into this abyss that we talk about with Nietzsche. You can drive yourself towards that, and that's really how Dr. Erickson is formulated, right? Like he's so focused on humanity as a whole, just like Dostoevsky mentions how he hates men in particular. He's focused on humanity as a whole, and that drives him towards this really negative outlook because he can see the denigration of humanity as a whole. And so not only are we saying Raskolnikov in his world, in his story, he's wrong, right? Like he is completely wrong. We're not saying necessarily that Dr. Erickson is wrong because we do show in the story that there is a denigration of society, and he is driven crazy because he loves humanity, but he feels hopeless. But we are saying that he talks himself into this further and further hole where he doesn't help but he hurts, and he hates about himself. And so a lot of this rationalistic type of thinking, uh, and this complex interplay between your intuition and your rationalistic thinking and how that plays out is very Raskolnikov. So, Cole, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think using Dr. Erickson as kind of like the focal point of our inspiration for Dostoevsky is perfect. Just the way he thinks himself into that hole and the way he rationalizes it, the way you can see where he has the ideas that we want, that are the good ideas we're trying to present aside, but he's so hopeless because of everyone around him. It's a very it's a very great concept to explore in our works because I think that's something that a lot of people don't discuss when they're trying to push for change, or like have like a big movement. Well, you need everyone else around you, and when everyone else around you fails, where does your heart go then? And you can kind of just see Dr. Erickson's loss of energy, his disinterest in it now because it just seems so helpless. And that's just straight from Dostoevsky. That's just influenced straight from him.
Exactly, exactly. And I'll still touch on some other stuff about Dostoevsky briefly. So
Yeah,
Dostoevsky has this huge idea, very popular for Dostoevsky, is that utopians can't exist. And the reason for that is because everyone has this radical need for autonomy and to make their own decisions. So you can put people in a perfect situation, a perfect world, and say, okay, if you act like this, things will be perfect for you, and you'll have a very easy life. And they can have an easy life, for instance. But there's this draw, this need to make your own decisions and feel like you're a part of this world and feel like you're making a difference, making your own decisions. And so we took a lot of inspiration from that, where the people tried to make a utopian, right? So the changes in our world, we didn't just make them arbitrarily or randomly or because they're in society today, but also because you could argue, at least somewhat plausibly, that they could help humanity in some way, right? Like, let's say, like just a push and pull relationship. That's what I'm getting at. So let's say our focus on is free speech. Well, the benefit of that is that with the lack of free speech in our world, the benefit is you have more tolerance, right? You can govern tolerance, and you can have people be more kind to each other in words, which will translate to thoughts. Like it's not a bad, terrible thought. Obviously, we disagree with it, but you can build an argument for it, right? Like you can understand the humanity nature to it, like the human aspect of these type of laws. So our idea was that people will still tend towards this utopian, but it's impossible, and they will always be unhappy with it. So this very very far left type, right, where it's like lack of free speech. No matter what laws you change, because of progressive nature, no matter what laws you change, they will always find something that they don't like about it. Um, and I'm not saying it's wrong or good or bad or whatever, but uh, it's just a philosophy of unhappiness in my eyes, and that's a big thing for me. Is I don't want them to be unhappy, and through this book, I was able to show a little bit like changing these laws, you will still find a lot of unhappiness, and maybe even more so because now the other side is joined in that abyss, right? I might have not articulated that as well as I would hoped, but I hope the idea was still pretty clear. And then another brief point I wanted to mention on this one, even more brief, is he doesn't love the idea of ignorance is bliss. As much as Dostoevsky's a wisdom type of man, and he's type of emotional type person, he always thought you should know, be in the know, right? So the ignorance is bliss. Uh, that's a big thing in our story because I know Cole, this was a thing for you actually, so you might be able to talk on it. You have you've implemented those governmental uh, broadcasts where they're essentially saying be comfortable not knowing because it's for your safety. And so there's an obsession with safety, which, as we know, obsessions with safety are from usually childhood traumatic experiences with parental figures, but they're also problematic in terms of leading to more mental instability and disorders, and then also neuroticism. So, Cole, if you want to talk more about that obsession with safety and not being in the know rather than having,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, there seems to be safety in ignorance, or so people think. I think that's what our part of the discussion is. There's not any safety in ignorance. That is a facade. That is a false image you would put it up. But it does feel safe when you don't know. It's you know when it's easier to accept that you're not in a cage when you're in a cage because people are telling you you're not in a cage. If that makes sense, it's easier to just let it be right. It's easier to just let the people think for you. You don't have to necessarily worry about failing or necessarily worry about putting you in positions where you will become more uncomfortable. But as we discussed earlier, being able to struggle and being able uncomfortable is exactly what helps you grow. So if you're ignorant the whole time, you'll never grow. You'll just stay in that same place, in that type of purgatory, in that cage. So, yeah.
yeah, and that's actually something we have in our book. Remember, we say the trade off for like the ignorance and comfortability is intellectual versatility. We say that in Dante's one of his speeches. So no, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a really good point, Cole. And then
Absolutely.
the final point I wanted to mention is the biggest point, the most philosophical point. So we won't go in depth about it, but it's the biggest thing for me. So it's his inclination towards having precedence of emotions rather than logic, right? So he always put rationality and logic a little bit lower than our natural emotions, and he understood that humans are emotional beings, and they have these primitive and almost idiotic needs, you could say, if you're looking at it from a very rationalistic standpoint. Now, the reason that this was a huge thing for Cole and I is because we have an interest and a focus on religion. Um, so we believe that these intellectual atheist types, right? Which is, we could even describe ourselves as that. So we're kind of, you know, discussing ourselves a little bit in these types is, uh, it's not reasonable, and I'm saying this broadly and philosophically, but we say it's not reasonable or uh, understandable to say that God exists, to conclude that God exists, right? It's more of an emotional inclination and primitive inclination. However, and Dr. Erickson talks about that too, but however, having that sense of uh, purpose and meaning and the reach beyond oneself, which is the third aspect of having a purpose, of culminating a purpose, is you reach beyond oneself, right? Religion is an automatic way to have that. And so even though it might be rationalistic to dispel with religion, it might not be the best decision for humanity in general. And that's really the culmination of nihilism is because of that atheistic push towards rationalism. So, we would never say people in this world are less intelligent or stupid, because we'd even understand that they're really focused more on the rationalistic aspects of society. So maybe even they're perhaps smarter, right? But they do ignore that aspect of religion. And they don't ignore that aspect in a lot of stuff, because if you think about the free speech conversation, they do put that precedence over feelings versus the logical autonomy that you should provide, right? However, with religion in particular, is what we're talking about here, they don't. They do ignore that aspect of the evolutionary history of religion that predates to 66,000 years ago. So that's ingrained into the human being fiber, right?
Yeah.
So the next inspirations we want to talk about was Carl Jung and Plato. We won't say much about those. We'll say that for the next video with symbolism, because most of most of their inspiration is embedded within symbolism and imagery and complex ideas related to those. So we won't talk too much about those, but the last inspiration we really, really wanted to discuss was tragedies. So Cole, go ahead and talk about, tragedies, Antigone, Hippolytus, whatever one that you thought was prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both mentioned are very prevalent. You came to me with the idea of really, really wanting to write a tragedy. Like, I feel like that was your one. You're like, this is my one thing. Like, it has to be a tragedy. It has to end with a tragedy. And I'll be interested to get into your thoughts here in a second about exactly why a tragedy. Because I guess I never really talked too much about. I was just kind of like, yeah, definitely a tragedy for sure. Um, but my experiences for tragedies and how they're used necessarily. I guess that's where I'm going to take this discussion. Is they're really used for more poignant points for very to really try and like hit that main moral home type of deal, those type of ideas. I feel like tragedies really help emphasize that. When you get like more emotional pull, and you get more you know, that type of reflective feeling after you read, when you're kind of like happy, it's easier to kind of like just move on and just be happy. But when you're sad or like you're made to feel sad about these characters, it makes you really think, it really reflect on that specific character's journey. And I think that's exactly what happens with how we use Dante here. It seems so perilous from the start, and it always was perilous. There was never really a chance for him ever. I mean, he's going up against literally the whole world. As we put it, the court is up to public opinion, like they vote on it. So it's him against the whole world. It's very hard for him, but him being in those sets of circumstances and being through such traumatic things is what adds so much emphasis on the issue of those particular I said things earlier, that wasn't a great word for it, but those particular concepts like hedonism, nihilism being enacted out in the world. So yeah, that's what I think tragedies are so great for, and I think that's why ours fit the tragedy so well. But I was really curious to why you were so set on the tragedy from the start.
Yeah. So I think you brought up a lot of good points. I'll go a little bit a different direction for why I was so inclined towards it. So, realistically, any hero's journey that doesn't end in this tragic fashion, where with the death, like the ancient Greek tragedies that we like so much, they seem spurious, in my opinion. Like, you have a character who is against the world, right? Like you have a character who's so adamant on disabusing and disillusioning individuals of their say misperceptions, but also just their harmful lifestyles, right? Like it doesn't have to be a misperception, but they're really playing a dangerous game. Um, and we know it's for the better. Like the readers who read the book, they're like, oh, they're saving individuals by changing the way that they see life, right? So we want to reflect that, but flip it on its head, right? Because most of the time there's this happy ending where it's like, oh, they changed the most amount of people to a better type of lifestyle, and now things are all good and rainbows. But the reality is, when you're fighting a system, when you're fighting a structure of society, you make incremental changes. You don't make these drastic, huge shifts. And our character certainly wasn't the one who was going to make those drastic, huge shifts. So it was important for me that if he's going to fight the whole entire societal structure, if he's going to disabuse people of their delusions, it's inevitably the inevitable conclusion is that it will end tragedy or end in tragedy, because there's no other plausible way that Dante could have gotten through this world while really striking at the core of so many individuals. People people do not want to hear that their life is not lived the right way. That can really harm their psyche. So it's a type of defense mechanism, ego defense mechanism, to strike against what has given you that harm. So it seems like the foregone conclusion for Dante is it has to be a tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really adds to the idea that as soon as he gets into the world, it's too far gone. Like if we get to this point, it's too far gone. The idea of our novel is we need to be preventative about these harmful concepts to prevent a world like this, because
Yeah.
there's really no going back after you're that far into it.
Yeah, and tying it to our book, like how you just did, um, like of course, like we wanted to show how drastically different only 30, 40 years could make, because it's 2059, only 30 years could make, really. So we wanted to show how different scientists from today could go into the future and see how the lack of science, the lack of autonomy, the lack of you know purpose and meaning. We wanted to show how drastically that can change so quickly with societal influence, because like we mentioned, a lot of social norms are the biggest influence for behavior. So social norms, if they shift, we could change like that as a society. And so it's important to show the difference, the drastic difference between the two ideologies. And the best way to do that would be to culminate and to have it culminate in a tragedy, I believe, to show how different they view a scientist from 30 years ago versus in their time, where everything's very particular. This was a fun conversation. Thanks for talking to me about the inspiration for Don't Say Cis. I had a great time.
Absolutely, always a joy. I love talking about books. And uh, working with you is always great. So it's anytime.
Leave in the comments, if you're a viewer, if you read the book, leave in the comments other sources of inspiration you think we might have had, and we'll be more than free to talk to you about it. So,
Or if you have recommendations based off of our inspirations you might find we're interested in, would love to read those materials.
I love it. All right, see ya.